Welcome to the Onion Buns. In this episode of Lying Lefties, I'm actually not going to say a whole bunch of stuff. Instead, I'm going to let NDP Nikki Ashton tell you about Mark Carney. I don't know a lot about, I don't really follow the Indigenous issues, so I'm not really knowledgeable on them. She is. So rather than me ranting and raving and, I keep telling you guys about Mark Carney. I keep showing you the newspaper articles, the videos. This guy's not a nice guy. He's not a good guy. He's not an honorable guy. He's not an ethical guy. He is a pathological liar. And honestly, it appears more and more that he is a criminal. It really does. So anyway, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to let Nikki Ashton tell you all about Mark Carney. I think it's very interesting, and the reason why it's on Lying Lefties is because, well, by default, Mark Carney's lied on everything about this, so it fits. So here we go.
Today, I want to talk to you more about Mark Carney. A lot of Northern and Indigenous people are wondering who Mark Carney is, who Mark Carney really is. What is clear is the following. We know Mark Carney doesn't want Canadians to know about his business involvements. He doesn't want us to know about his record and the record of his company. And let's recap what we've learned in the last couple of weeks. Brookfield, a company that was named by the Centre for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research, was named Canada's top tax avoider to the tune of billions of dollars. These are billions of dollars that could have gone to building and strengthening Northern and Indigenous communities. But now let's also look at his time as vice chair, responsible for environmental, social, and governance at Brookfield, and how he treated Indigenous communities. While Carney was pretending to work on making the world a more sustainable place as vice chair of environmental social governance at Brookfield, the reality was very different. Under Carney's environmental leadership, Brookfield trampled on First Nations rights and fought them in court every step of the way.
Okay, as I said, I don't know much about the Indigenous stuff, but she is 100% right. Carney is not an environmentalist. He uses the environment to make his money. He doesn't give a shit about the environment. What we know, Carney deforested 22,000 acres of the Brazilian rainforest. That alone, Canada could remove all carbon initiatives, to reduce carbon and just go down to the ground and just mine, pull oil out, blah, 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 and we still could not come close to the damage Carney did to the worldwide environment by cutting down 22,000 acres of the Brazilian rainforest. So right there, him calling himself an environment or anyone calling him an environmentalist, they are full of shit. He's not. But it goes beyond that. He built pipelines for Saudi, but he blocked pipelines in Canada. And he actually argued with Poilievre on this point that it was good for the world that he built those pipelines. Well, if Canada can't get pipelines, why is it good for Saudi to get pipelines? The answer is he made money off it. He sold U.S. coal to China. China has the largest carbon footprint in the world. Like, Canada could destroy its economy, go right down to net zero, and we wouldn't even move the needle on the world carbon stage. Like, that's how little carbon we create. China creates like 45% of the world's carbon. Just that one country. But Carney sold U.S. coal, the dirtiest form of fuel, to China, increasing their carbon footprint. Does that sound like an environmentalist to you? Doesn't to me. The list goes on the stuff that he's done that is not environmentally friendly. Carney, I keep saying this, but again, Carney is a pathological liar. He will tell you what you want to hear or what he thinks you want to hear. And if you push back, he'll get really angry. Like, really, the guy has a serious anger issue. And yeah, I wouldn't want to be related to him because I'm not going to go beyond that. But anytime I've seen anger issues like that, it wasn't good behind the scenes. And I'm going to leave it at that. So, yeah, so let's hear what else she has to say.
Nothing could be more clear than what Mississauga First Nation has had to deal with. Privatization, backdoor deregulation, fighting for their rights. When Ontario privatized and deregulated the dams in their territory, Mark Carney's company Brookfield took them over.
Here's something I started to wonder. Like, I didn't know who the hell Brookfield was before Mark Carney. I really didn't. I'd never heard of him. I'm quite astute politically, and I'd never heard of him. I guess they were one of those backdoor power lobbyists. They were lobbyists, for lack of a better term. Even though Harper tried to get rid of lobbyists, apparently Justin brought him back in. So, okay. But it seems like all of these contracts either go to SNL, Lavalin, or Brookfield. Amazing how SNL, Lavalin, and Brookfield are connected to Trudeau, connected to the Liberals. Gee, sounds like corruption to me. Smells like corruption to me. Maybe, I guess we know why Carney doesn't want us to find out about his conflicts of interest, because this keeps coming up daily. Every day, we're finding more and more out about this.
It's been a battle ever since for the First Nation to have their rights respected. It got to the point where the First Nation had to go to court to assert their Indigenous rights. So what was the response of Mark Carney and his company? To fight them in court. Mississauga First Nation lawyers summed it up best when they said, quote, they had been cut to its knees by its project. Internationally, whether it's First Nations in Maine, in the United States, or Indigenous peoples in Brazil, this is a company funding initiatives impacting the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples and the environment. Turns out Carney's definition of investing in green energy includes violating Indigenous water rights and steamrolling First Nations. At a time when Canadians need leaders to have their backs, Mark Carney's refusal to be transparent about his assets and conflicts of interest raised a lot of concerns.
True.
In 1 week, in January alone, both the Brookfield CEO and the chairperson of the Brookfield Partners Foundation made the maximum donation to Carney's campaign for Liberal leadership.
Shocker.
Canadians deserve to know what Mark Carney is hiding and who Mark Carney is working for.
Totally.
And just today, Mark Carney announced that he is canceling the proposed capital gains tax increase, a tax that benefits millionaires. Canadians want to know, is this the reward for rich CEOs donating to his campaign and supporting his leadership? Which brings us to Mark Carney's actions as Liberal leader vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples and reconciliation. Let's be clear, the more we get to know about Mark Carney, his time at Brookfield, and Mark Carney as Liberal leader, the more we recognize that he's not part of the solution, but part of the problem.
100%.
A pattern of fighting Indigenous peoples in court, just like the Liberal government does. A pattern of not getting it on how significant the housing crisis or the infrastructure crisis is in communities, much like the Liberals. Mark Carney and the Liberals, when they see the North, when they see our region, they see resources, they see land, but they don't see the people. Let's be clear, the Liberals have only ever acted when the NDP pushes them to do so.
Okay, that's a lie. The NDP has been propping up the Liberals for the last 4 years. You have voted to support everything Justin and Carney have wanted to do in the last 4 years. I am so tired of the NDP not taking responsibility for the damage they have done. You propped up Trudeau, and I'm not a Trudeau fan. I'm not a Carney fan. I'm not an Elizabeth I Fall Down Nightly fan, May fan, and I'm not a Christina Freeland fan. But you held the power for the last 4 years. You could have brought down the Liberal government and we would have a new government today. Would it be better? It couldn't. It certainly couldn't be worse. But that's on you. So stop blaming everybody else. Take responsibilities for the actions you partook in. You guys should have told Jagmeet Singh to go fly a kite and voted down the Liberals when they were doing all these damaging policies. But you supported him. So carry your own blame.
Today, we have a message from Mark Carney. In 2025, this is not acceptable. What you and your company have done is not acceptable. And what you have done so far as Liberal leader is not what reconciliation is all about. After everything that has happened historically, given the housing crisis, given the infrastructure crisis, what you, Mark Carney, have demonstrated in business and in the short period that you've been leader is you don't get it. Only the NDP stands with Northern and Indigenous peoples.
Another lie. Poilievre's been racking up great points with the Indigenous people. He's including them. He's empowering them. They're standing firmly behind him, or at least their leaders are. I can't speak for the, like I say, I don't follow Indigenous issues, so I can only tell you what I read in the media. And the media says that the Indigenous people are very enamored with Pierre Poilievre. They're not. You look at the polls, they're not enamored with Jagmeet Singh and the NDP right now. As much as I like what she's saying about Carney, and when it comes to Carney, she's telling the truth. But when it comes to the NDP, once again, it's excuses. It's lies. You are not the champion of the people, and you haven't been. For at least 12 years, I would go further back, but I didn't like Jack Layton either, or Thomas Mulcair, but whatever. Under Jagmeet Singh, your party has lost all focus and direction.
And the message for the rest of us is Mark Carney isn't in it for Northern and Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Miigwech Kinanaskomet now. We'd like to open it up to any questions.
So just before we move to questions, I will replay Lori Idlaut's video. We had a small technical issue in the beginning, so we will play it again with sound. We will go ahead and do that, and then I will invite media to use the raise hand function to ask their question and follow up.
Hello, my name is Lori Idlaut. I'm the Member of Parliament for Nunavut, joining you from the beautiful community of Tukiptukjak. I'm sorry I couldn't join you as originally planned. I'm joining you by giving you this recording to share my thoughts about Mark Carney and the Liberals as they seek a third term as a Liberal government. One thing is very clear to me, they don't get it. They don't care about Indigenous peoples. They don't care about protecting Indigenous people's lands, and they don't care to invest in the Arctic. Invest in Indigenous people's infrastructure. There's a huge infrastructure deficit, and we have not heard what this Liberal government will do to make changes. All we're seeing are repeated announcements that were promised, that were broken repeatedly, and still happening at the same time. Even just when he was in Iqaluit recently, the investments for the North was 25 times less than what he promised to work on a radar system.
Carney just re-announced a radar system that was announced over 2 decades ago. He's acting like this is his great idea. Well, I guess we see this from Carney all the time. It's like Poilievre announces something and Carney steals it. But he steals it and he changes it, and it's less effective than what Poilievre announced. And it's the same thing here. The radar system has been talked about for 2 or 3 decades. I honestly don't know how long. It's been around for most of my life, this topic. And it just keeps getting punted down the road. And anyone who thinks Carney's going to follow through on that promise, again, you're a moron. We know exactly what Trudeau and Carney have done. And they're not going to follow through. It's an election gimmick. He's promising something. It's like Trudeau's promise of the bullet train between Toronto and Montreal. It's never going to get built. It's just not. Trudeau had no funding and no power to make that announcement, but he made the announcement because it played well in the press. That's all it was. And it's just like the radar system. We should have bases up in the Arctic. We should have radar systems up in the Arctic. And we should have had them 50 years ago. But under Trudeau Sr., Pierre. He promised it as well, now that I'm thinking of it. Never carried through on it. I voted for Gretchen. Gretchen never carried through on it. They keep promising and people keep believing them, but there's never any carry through on these things. And there won't be on this one.
As with the NDP, we would invest in Nunavut Mill in Northerners so that they can be engaged in Arctic security, Arctic sovereignty. These are just some small examples of the Liberal failures that we're going to continue to see. They may have a new leader, but it will be the same party that continues to break promises. So I do hope that you take this seriously as you consider who you're going to vote for.
Vote Conservative.
We will now go to questions from media. Please use the raise hand function to ask your question and follow up. We'll go ahead and start with Brett Forrester with the CBC. Please go ahead.
Hello, Brett here with CBC Indigenous in Ottawa. This lawsuit by Mississauga First Nation involves a second-tier subsidiary of Brookfield, so it's essentially a grandchild company of Carney's firm. Why do you feel it's fair to pin this on him?
CBC, right out of the gate, they come trying to defend Carney. Like, if you need any more obvious examples of how corrupt the CBC is, how unethical the CBC is, you just got it. Right out of the gate, they came running to Carney's defense.
Personally, given the apparent distance between Brookfield and the company involved in this lawsuit.
Hello, Brett. Thanks for joining us. So I'd say right at the outset, Mark Carney was in a leadership role at Brookfield, and
Mark Carney was the chairman of Brookfield. He was the top dog. The buck stopped with him. That's all there is to know.
The buck stops with the leader. I think what we've seen in recent weeks that there's a lot of questions about his time at Brookfield, and we have virtually no answers, both in terms of his investments, but also in terms of the projects he's involved in, including possible conflicts of interest with respect to his role at this time.
Speaking of conflict of interest, I just found out the other day. You remember when Justin was pushing the heat pumps? And he was pushing them hard. They're made by Brookfield. That was a Brookfield product. It was clear collusion. And yeah, it should have never been allowed to happen because Carney at that time was working for Justin Trudeau. He was still in charge of Brookfield, but he was also Trudeau's economic advisor. And oh my God, he advised him to push heat pumps. So it benefited Brookfield. Come on, people.
I think what we've seen, and Laura Mayer alluded to this, is Mark Carney didn't have an Indigenous platform. Mark Carney refused to engage with APTN during the leadership, the only Liberal leadership candidate to do so. We know that Mark Carney got rid of the Crown Indigenous Relations as a standalone ministry and folded it into the Department of Justice, which is, of course, the department that fights First Nations. And his slogan, "Spend less, invest more," as Ms. Mayer pointed out, is not code. It's a clear indication that Indigenous and Northern communities are on the chopping block. And of course, as MP Lori Idlout pointed out, the announcements in Nunavut were recycled announcements that had already been brought forward by the Liberal government. Announcements that we'd also pushed for, but also announcements that pale in comparison to the radar announcement that he made for Nunavut. Instead of investing in Nunavut, instead of investing in Northern and Indigenous communities.
Okay, I do have to jump in here. The Indigenous communities get an amazing amount of money, be it a Conservative government or a Liberal government. Their problem, and maybe I'm going to take heat for this, but their problem is the corruption within their own population. Somehow all that money isn't making it into their communities. And that's a real problem. And I honestly feel for those communities because they're getting ripped off. But I don't think it's fair when you're talking the dollars. I don't really think it's fair to blame the government for what's happening in Indigenous communities. Now, what I do think is the government's fault, and this was one of my criticisms of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, whom I'll be fully transparent. I'm 59 years old. Stephen Harper was the best Canadian Prime Minister in my lifetime, period. End of story. But he wasn't perfect and he made a few mistakes. And one of the mistakes I felt, we shouldn't be sending so much money to the Indigenous communities because, again, there's a corruption issue. We should be sending experts there, water experts, infrastructure experts, building experts, training them, teaching them, and helping them improve their communities. Like there's that drinking water issue that's been going on for 30, 40 years, it seems like. Why haven't we sent water experts there to clean up the water? We must have the technology. We have to have the technology that they need to get their water clean, to get them a reliable water source. They're in the Arctic, for fuck's sakes. They're surrounded by snow and water. So rather than sending money, let's send the personnel to help them with their products. Now, I will say, I do know Harper tried to start to do this, and he got significant pushback by the Indigenous community chiefs and leaderships. So, but again, there's corruption at that top level, and there's always been corruption at that top level. So when I hear somebody saying we need to send more money, I disagree fully. We need to help them. We should be helping them, but we need to send the correct aid. Spending money is like what Trudeau did for the last 10 years overseas. He just fired off money, taxpayer money, to anyone that asks in the UN. Didn't do any good. Most of it is unaccountable, we're finding out. It never makes it to where it's going. You can't spend dollars on these problems. These are boots on the ground problems. You need personnel to fix the problems.
The way it's needed, given the infrastructure crisis, given the housing crisis, he's choosing to do do something else with that money, like investing in radar, like canceling the capital gains increase. But really, we think that it's very clear. Questions need to be asked about Carney's time at Brookfield in a leadership role. The buck stops with him, and the fact that a First Nation here in Canada had to go to court to fight obviously the Ontario government and Brookfield based on the duty to consult, based on Indigenous rights, is deeply problematic in terms of Carney's track record as leader. He's somebody who we have to be clear, he can't hide behind corporate structures. This was Mark Carney's company, and Mark Carney was in senior leadership. I would say in terms of more details, in terms of the case and the First Nations experience, we acknowledge that Chief Niganab of Mississauga First Nation is the main spokesperson.
Yeah.
And as a follow-up, you mentioned a pattern of these sorts of incidents impacting First Nations, but I only heard one example. So what else is there? What other examples are there?
Well, in terms of, there seems to be a story with hydroelectric dams. We know that there is a First Nation in Maine in the United States that has pushed back on Brookfield for very similar reasons.
There is a number of countries, so I'm just going to say USA for Maine, but it's Peru and a number of countries have all filed suits against Brookfield for dishonest practices and criminal charges. And Mark Carney was the chairman, the head guy for those cases.
With a fair bit of support from... and
CBC knows this well. Again, this is CBC carrying water for the Liberals and Mark Carney. That's all this is. The state apparatus there in Maine. We know that there's also real concerns about what's transpired in Brazil around hydroelectric dams. Yep. And the impacts on communities in that country. Mark Carney displaced an entire civilization. It was primitive people living primitive lifestyles, but when he cut down those 22,000 acres of Brazilian rainforest, he cut down their home. That was their home. They had nowhere to go. Nobody's heard what happened to them. Nobody knows what happened to them. But common sense tells us you take primitive people that have never even seen a cell phone or a computer or a pair of sneakers, and you displace them into modern society. They're either going to become criminals, drug addicts, or dead because they lack the skills and the knowledge to progress in modern society. Because Brookfield certainly didn't hug them all up and train them and help them. No, they just displaced them. And that was Mark Carney.
Again, a lot of questions to be asked. Mark Carney cannot hide by corporate structures. There's already so little we know about Mark Carney's time at Brookfield in terms of and because of his lack of disclosures, and we deserve to hear. We deserve answers. Canadians deserve answers. First Nations deserve answers. Indigenous and Northern communities deserve answers about Mark Carney's track record and where Mark Carney stands clearly when it comes to Indigenous and Northern communities. And so far, the signs from the last couple of weeks are problematic. Canada has moved very far when it comes to the recognition that as Laura pointed out, Canada has a responsibility when it comes to reconciliation, and we're not seeing that reflected in Mark Carney's leadership, and we're obviously seeing that was in many ways not the case during his time at Brookfield. And I just want to add internationally, I mean, the stories out of Brazil involve clear cutting forests, devastating impacts in terms of the environment there.
Yep.
These are all questions that I think are point to a problematic approach from Mark Carney and his company, and that deserve to be investigated now that he's leading our country.
One last call for questions. Please use the raise hand function to ask your question and follow up. I see no more questions, so this concludes our press conference. Ceci conclut notre conférence de presse. I will give it back to you, Nikki, for closing.
Well, thank you very much, Nina, and thank you so much, Laura, Mayor. Thank you to Laurie Idlout for joining us and for the journalists that have joined us today. But what we need right now is real leadership committed to Indigenous justice, committed to making a difference in the lives of Northern and Indigenous peoples, committed to reconciliation. It's not what we're seeing from Mark Carney. It's not what we've seen in many ways from Liberals in the past. But certainly it's what Indigenous peoples, what Northern peoples deserve going forward. Thank you very much. Merci.
So there you have it. Right out of the NDP mouth again. I love using lefties to expose lefties. Something bothers me about this. Now, I'm no NDP fan. I've said time and time again, I am not a socialist and I will never be a socialist. That doesn't mean there's not some good ideas from the socialist platform, but you take those ideas. You don't embrace the entire socialist agenda. So anyway, still, I'm disturbed that she came out with a really important press conference, video press conference, and only the CBC showed up, and the CBC only showed up to defend Mark Carney. Where was Global? Where was the Globe and Mail? Where was CTV? Where was the Toronto Red Star? Where was Maclean's? Where was the Rebel? Where was, I can't think of any other, National Post? Where was the mainstream media or even the alternative media? This seems like something that people should have been reporting on and covering. But this is part of the problem with the mainstream media nowadays is if it's critical of Mark Carney and the Liberals, they don't touch it. They don't cover it. They don't report on it. And you just saw firsthand, she had one reporter and he only asked questions to defend Carney, to make excuses for Carney. It was the CBC. Big shocker there. They got $1.4 billion in reasons to support the Liberals. And if it works out for them, that goes up to 2.5 billion reasons. So how can you take anything they say as honest? They're as corrupt as Carney is. But yeah, she did a fairly reasonable job, except for the NDP rah-rah bandwagon stuff that the more I hear it, the more I want to vomit. It's lies. the NDP doesn't stick up for the workers. It doesn't stick up for Canada. It has been propping up the Liberals for the last 4 years. So, you know, if you have a problem with what the Liberals did over the last 4 years, and I certainly do, then you have to take your share of the blame in that problem because you propped them up. You enabled them. Hey, just a brief add-on to Lying Lefties. This just came out yesterday. The Toronto Red Star, who gets part of that $600 million Liberal slush fund, is, well, they're carrying water. It's not just the CBC. Doug Ford had a conversation with Pierre Poilievre about the mineral rights that the Liberals have been blocking and holding up for 10 years in Ontario. It's the first time Doug Ford ever talked to Pierre Poilievre. They had a brief conversation and everything, and that was it. Well, the Toronto Red Star fabricated a story that Poilievre called up Ford asking for help on how to deal with Carney. Well, Ford's come out and said that's a lie. I mean, this doesn't surprise me. The Toronto Red Star lost relevancy as a legitimate newspaper 30 years ago, maybe more. It was once a powerhouse, a bastion of journalism. Now most people wouldn't line their bird cages with it in fear that they might infect their birds with some sort of disease. So anyway, let's take a look. So here's the article from the Toronto Red Star. Insiders say Poilievre called Doug Ford for advice, but the Premier said he'll be staying out of politics. Again, Ford has come out and said this is a flat-out lie. Didn't happen. All right, here's the announcement that Ford and Poilievre were talking about, which spurred on the Toronto Red Star to fabricate a story about it being about Poilievre calling to ask for help in dealing with Carney. The left will go to no limits, stop at no limits, to fabricate lies if they think it helps their ideology.
I'm announcing that a Conservative government will bring forward Canada First shovel-ready zones, areas pre-approved for large-scale industrial and resource projects.
This is such a good idea. Like, this is brilliant. I never thought of this. I heard nobody talking about it, but this is absolutely brilliant. And the best part about it is Carney can't steal this idea because Carney doesn't want those minerals, oil and gas out of the ground. No matter what he says, he doesn't want them out of the ground. And if he ever tried to steal this policy by Poilievre, his base would turn on him.
This is how it will work. First, we will identify a spot that looks appropriate for a mine, a pipeline, an LNG plant, a power station, a hydroelectric dam. Second, we will make sure that the place is safe and that it won't harm the people or the environment to put the project there. Third, my government will do the necessary environmental studies in partnership and collaboration with the provinces, municipalities, and we will carry out the necessary constitutionally required consultations with the First Nations up front so that they can be done before the investors even step up. Fourth, when all of this is done, we will offer pre-permitting before we even get applications, so that permits can be published online with a required checklist of actions that businesses must take to comply in protecting people and the environment. Then businesses would have all the information, legally binding, published online that they could use to make a real investment decision. This will be necessary after years of uncertainty where businesses spent billions of dollars and many years getting to a maybe. They will know that they have a yes up front. They can do the math, pencil it out, and get busy. I'm also announcing that a common sense Conservative government will work to make LNG Canada here in the Saguenay region one of those shovel-ready zones, pre-approved, so that we can ship Western Canadian LNG through a pipeline to this region, liquefy it here using the great workers of the Saguenay to get it done.
So yeah, that was his press announcement. How do you get that announcement and come up with Poilievre's asking Ford for help? Like, I don't see how you get that connection. This benefits Ontario greatly. Like, this hugely, like, if any Ontario person votes against Poilievre now, after that announcement, they're not interested in helping Ontario. It's really that simple. This one announcement is the biggest announcement I've heard in the last, I'm going to say 30 years regarding Ontario. It's huge. This allows them to get their rare minerals out of the ground. And it helps other provinces with LNG and everything. And it's going to help the Inuit hugely. But yeah, so you decide. I don't see how the Toronto Red Star came up with that story off of that clip, but they did. And again, Doug Ford has come out today and said, Poilievre asked me no such thing, and the Toronto Red Star story is false. 100% false. So, yeah, it seems like the manipulation, the lies, and the misdirections of the mainstream media are in full election mode to promote the Liberals and Mark Carney at any cost. And hopefully, Canadians will see through it. That's the end of this episode of Lying Lefties. Change the name a bit. If you like this video, leave a like and subscribe, please. If you didn't like this video, leave a dislike. As always, feel free to leave a comment. Don't worry, I don't swing my cane too strongly anymore if I dislike your comment. And as always, pew, 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 and shit. Thanks for watching. Bye.